This is Patriot to the Core podcast, and I am your host, Thad Forrester. Thank you for listening to what is now episode number 19. Today's guest is Larry Moores, who was a platoon leader on the ground at the Battle of Mogadishu, which is known, as Black Hawk Down. He was a member of the 3rd Ranger Battalion, and he just describes what it was like on the ground there when their mission quickly changed to a search and rescue after the Blackhawks were shot down. And he just tells us some things that they learned from that mission, what it was like there in the kind of in the heat of it. And so I had a great conversation with him, and he's a very generous guy. He was, very, very generous with his time, and so I really appreciate him. So I'll bring him on. Okay, Mr. Larry Moores. Before we get into the Black Hawk Down story, would you kind of just give me your background in the Army and why you joined and leading up to your mission, your battle to the Battle of Mogadishu?
Sure. Just a little military background. I was an Air Force brat as a kid. My dad was a B-52 maintenance guy. I was born out in western Oklahoma. So my brother and I had some of that service and military instilled in us in young ages. My brother was accepted to West Point to the military academy when I was a junior in high school. So that even heightened it more. I was a hockey player in school and wasn't quite as academic as my brother was. So I didn't apply to school. I wanted to join the military, build a little discipline, and my brother gave me some great advice. You'll go to a good unit when you go in, and you'll build a good foundation, whether you decide to get out and go to school or whether you decide to stay in the military. Either way, it's going to help you. And as a 17-year-old kid, I didn't really take that for what it was worth, and now I look back at it like wow, that was amazing. From a 19-year-old brother to a 17-year-old little brother, it really paid big dividends. So I went straight to the Rangers as a young kid. 18 years old, I left home 6 days after I graduated from high school. Went right to the Rangers and deployed about a year later to Grenada as a young enlisted soldier. Just about a year in service in the Army, but again, a tremendous experience seeing this community and how it worked and how everybody shouldered more than their share. And it really taught me a lot of lessons about, when you have the right people on your right and left, and you don't have to worry about what they're doing and you can concentrate on your mission, it really makes the whole task force responsibility that much easier. And we'll talk about that a little more as we keep going, but that responsibility and accountability piece really was driven home at a young age. If you do what you're supposed to and people don't have to worry about you, it makes everybody else's role that much easier. So I spent a couple tours in the Rangers as an enlisted guy. Went down to Panama in between Ranger assignments, jumped down there in Central America for a couple years. Did a year in Korea, went back to the Rangers as a staff sergeant, and then left the 1st Ranger Battalion right before Panama in 1989. I was accepted to an assignment in Washington, D.C., was able to get a couple years of schooling under my belt and accepted to the Officer Candidate School. So while I loved being an NCO and working with the type of people I did, I also had a desire to do more and to get a commission and see the leadership from a little different perspective. As a young Ranger, as a 18, 19-year-old kid, I really had some tremendous leaders, both junior and senior officers that I worked with had an impact on me. And I always thought if I could have at least 80% of that impact on people that I led, then I was getting somewhere, because they were so good. And it really made me driven to be better as I came up through the ranks. And again, the deployments helped solidify that hey, when we have a good team and we train hard and we do everything we're supposed to, it makes these deployments and your ability to go into a bad situation a little bit easier.
So how did you, or maybe clarify this for me as a civilian, because I've been confused about this over the years. I think I've got it, but a ranger, there's actually a ranger unit, but there's also people who go to the ranger school that can be called a ranger. Is that how it works, or what's the difference?
Yeah, that's correct. So Ranger School is run by the Ranger Department at Fort Benning, and it's the Army's premier leadership school. It's 58 days. You don't eat well. You get a lot of leadership challenges along the way, jumping out of planes, not getting the right amount of sleep, and they really test your ability to lead in difficult situations. So, and that's the kind of test you want as a young leader in the military. So a lot of people want to go to that school because it shows your capabilities in tough circumstances. And what you want to do is you want to try and emulate that difficult situation from a leadership challenge before you actually get into a hostile fire situation. And you don't want to get too far on the opposite side of the risk assessment spectrum and start getting people injured or killed in training, but you want to test them as much as you can within the limits of that tough training spectrum. So the school is available to a lot of different people in the Army, but the Ranger Regiment is where active duty Rangers serve. There's 4 battalions. First Battalion is in Savannah, Georgia. The 2nd Battalion's in Fort Lewis, Washington. The 3rd Battalion's in Columbus at Fort Benning, and the Ranger Support Battalion is in Fort Benning also, where the Ranger Regimental Headquarters is. So the units are there. It's a very specific selection process to get in. There's an 8-week selection program for the young soldiers, and then there's a somewhat shorter selection and training program for the senior NCOs and officers to get in. So it's not open to everybody. There's a very tough selection process to get in, and every time you leave, you have to go through that same process to get back in. So I left a couple times, and the regiment hired me back, and I had to go through the same selection process no matter what rank I was. So it's on that behalf, the regiment does a great job of keeping the right people there, keeping you fresh, making sure you're meeting the standards, and being able to do that. So.
Okay. All right. Thanks for clearing that up. I wanted to make sure. I've heard several people I've met over the years, say I'm a Ranger, or somebody said he's a Ranger, but I think in that case they had gone through the school. They weren't actually in a battalion, Ranger battalion.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, the Rangers are a very small community. There's that joke about the special operations folks in the military. Less than 1% of the population in America is in the military, and about 1% of the military is special operations. And a guy said, "Why is it every time I go to a bar, everybody's in special operations?"
Yeah.
So it's an interesting perspective. It's one of those things that a lot of people want to do, and some people gave it a shot, and they might not have got there, but it's a better story to tell than
it is.
Than I didn't make it.
Well, the way I am is if somebody just voluntarily tells me something like that early on in the conversation, I don't believe them.
Sure. Yeah.
So,
some hesitation to buy into that. I agree.
Oh yeah. Well, I'd like to talk about your preparation now. When how much time did you have to prepare specifically for the mission to Mogadishu?
Well, it's interesting. We were actually we were deployed on a joint readiness training exercise. Every quarter, the Rangers and all the Joint Special Operations community do big exercises in different locations, and we were training in Fort Bliss, Texas. So we were out on an exercise. We were doing all kinds of training, and we were alerted while we were out there in Texas. And our home base was in Georgia. We never went back to Georgia to get any gear to tell anybody. We went straight to Fort Bragg to start training, and we had about an 8-day train-up process. So that was the extent of it. We were alerted in Texas. We flew to North Carolina. We linked up with our teammates, and we went through a 7-8 day build-up of here's different possible scenarios we could end up working, a template of how we're going to execute these missions, and we built from there. So it was very quick. Down and dirty. We weren't getting into too many specifics, but we felt comfortable as a task force that this was the right group of people to put together to go do this. But I think the Rangers, more than anybody, are suited to do these type of missions because you have an amazing foundation they build by doing repetitive training over and over, and sometimes it seems like it's over repetitive. But by having that great training base and understanding the fundamentals well, it really gives you the opportunity to do other branches and sequels off of that training foundation. So that really helped us as we went down there and started doing a lot of different operations.
Well, I figured you didn't have much time to prepare.
What
was your mission specifically?
The mission of the task force, or the mission
in Somalia,
specific to my element?
Correct. For your element in Somalia.
Yeah. Well, overall, our mission was to go down there and find Adid, who was the clan leader who was really causing a lot of turmoil in the city of Mogadishu at the time. So once we got down there, we realized we couldn't find him specifically. Our task force was to identify his lieutenants, any subordinates underneath him, where we could go in, disrupt their information chain, disrupt their leadership, and get people to talk and find out where the senior folks were. My specific mission as the ground reaction force platoon leader, I was one of 3 rifle platoon leaders down there, and I was responsible for all the convoy escorts, the blocking force for the mission inserts, and we also had a third mission of setting up the combat search and rescue mission for any downed aircraft. So we would go into certain parts of the city, test light poles on how much demo it took to knock down a light pole in case we had to cut down a power lines for a helicopter to get in, or a wall outside a building complex to see what kind of demo charges we would need. So we ran a lot of these different scenarios and tests on these capabilities that we had to have. So we stayed active. We tried not to set a big signature every time we left the compound that we were doing a mission. So we tried to stay active in the city and do a lot of different things.
How far was the compound from where all the action was taking place? Your compound?
Yeah, well, we lived on the airfield in Mogadishu City. So when we rolled outside the gate, it was a quarter mile from the hangar where we lived out into the city. So every time we went out the gate, we were in enemy territory. Okay. So it was super close. We lived amongst them. The high ground was just to the north of where we were, where our facility was. So they had eyes on and kept a pretty good visibility on a lot of our day-to-day activities, where we were going, what we were doing. So it was tough from a counter intel perspective to try and show them that we were doing things other than going into the city to find their lieutenants and their leadership.
So I guess, can you walk us through, because we all know things went wrong, but what, from your perspective and your team, what happened, and then when did they go wrong, and how did it affect your group?
Sure. Again, from a ground perspective, this was the 7th different major mission that we had conducted. Obviously, the 3rd and 4th of October gets a lot more visibility because of the books and because of everything, the way that day turned out. But we had conducted 6 very successful missions up to that date. We had captured a lot of subordinate leadership of Adid's. We had gone into different parts of the city in vehicle convoys, in just aircraft, in complete package, in daylight, nighttime. We tried to change up the scenario so it wasn't always the same type of package. But you look at the 3rd and 4th of October, and it's interesting because we went in during the daylight. We made a lot of tactical decisions based on prior missions. The guys who fast roped in the blocking positions didn't bring night vision, because the majority of our missions up to that point were an hour and a half max time. So we tailored our loads based on prior missions and expectations on the mission that we were conducting. From a ground forces perspective that day, it was much different when we went into the city, because there was fire from different blocking positions. We had guys wounded very quickly during the day. And prior missions, we'd had people engaged. We'd had guys wounded. We had been in some pretty good firefights up to that point, but nothing like on the 3rd. So, from a ground perspective, a tactical perspective that we conducted, they were much more prepared for our launch that day than they had been on previous days. They brought in additional fighters. They had additional weapon systems, and they were able to really change the face of that operation by hitting one of the Blackhawks with the RPGs.
Did you get a sense from the maybe a feeling or something that day that they had stepped up their game and they were prepared to really attack it with much more force that day?
Yeah, you never want to underestimate, and I don't think we went into missions overconfident. We always were prepared. We always took the task force that was suited for that specific area. We knew that we were going into a tougher part of the city that day, but I don't think we went in expecting the numbers and the amount of weapon systems and the amount of fighters that were available to them. Could they have been available on prior missions? Yes. Obviously, it's their city, and for some reason they flipped the switch that day and decided that they wanted to fight and be more proactive in what they were doing. Could they have done that on mission 4? Most certainly. Again, I'm an infantry guy, and I trained on a lot of different weapon systems. I'm not an expert with a RPG, but if you give me 4 or 5 of them and you hover a Blackhawk in a circle, 75, 100 feet above me, I'm going to hit it eventually. So they used, hey, we've got a lot of these weapon systems. Let's keep shooting these rockets until we get lucky, and they did. And it changed the whole scope of the mission and the events that day. So, and it was 45 minutes after mission launch, so it really made a huge impact on the sequence of events, our ability to get people out of the city, and then it turned into a day-long operation versus an hour, 90 minutes that we originally expected.
So when the Black Hawk is hit, how does your role change, and what are your responsibilities at that point?
Sure. Once the first Black Hawk went in, it split the elements. It becomes very difficult at that point to navigate within a city of enemy fighters who don't want you there. There's comments made in the book and in the movie about a lost convoy and inability to move from point A to point B. What they forget to take into consideration is that the enemy has a vote, and they didn't want us to get from point A to point B. And as difficult as it is, and we were pretty comfortable in the city because we had been there for a month and a half. We drove in the city, 4 to 5 days a week, and we felt comfortable in different parts of the city and understanding the people and whether they liked us or disliked us, if they threw stuff at us or if they welcomed us. So that day, once the aircraft went in, they had a vector point that they could concentrate their efforts on. They didn't have elaborate communication systems. They couldn't call platoon 1 and platoon 4 to maneuver to such and such an intersection, but they had a helicopter that was crashed, and they knew exactly where to go, and they did everything they could to keep our task force from getting to those sites. And then 20 minutes later, the second aircraft went in, and it even further complicated the events. You've got one. We split our ground reaction force at that point. Most of the personnel that were on foot that had fast roped into the main objective moved to the north crash site where Cliff Walcutt's aircraft was, and then I was in the second part of the convoy that tried to move to the southern crash site where Mike Durant was. So it became obvious fairly quickly that this was a different day, a different type of fighting. They knew where these aircraft were, and they actually had pretty basic signaling techniques that they used, but they were very effective. They would take a pile of trash, a couple tires off of vehicles, they would light them in these intersections, and it was a great beacon to bring fighters in. Hey, here's this huge burning black smoke of tires, and they all moved to it. So again, they were pretty efficient in the way they communicated and maneuvered within their own city to do that.
Wow. So how long what did you do? Did you ever get to Durant's Black Hawk, or how are you leading your men and all that good
Yeah,
start.
we had been in the city about 10 days earlier for another mission where we went in the middle of the night. We had a pretty direct route north-south, which would have led us pretty close to where we thought Durant's aircraft was. When we left the compound that afternoon, we tried to use that similar route because we had just been up there. We ran into a huge obstacle that they had in place because we'd already been in there. So they knew we may try to use that route. They had blocked it. We couldn't go that way. We tried an alternate route to the south and came up one road to the west of where Durant's aircraft was. So when we did the after-action review after the mission was complete, we realized and saw the footage of how close we were. But again, we were probably within 50 to 100 meters of Durant's aircraft at one point with a huge engagement. The Somali fighters had moved to where that aircraft was. They were moving to the aircraft, and we were trying to come up against that wave of fighters. And the decision was made from leadership, hey, don't fight through that objective that they're putting in place. Let's come back to the south and come up from a different angle.
And you're on foot at this point?
No, we were still in Humvees at that point. So we had a superiority advantage with the 50 cals and the Mark 19s that we had as part of our task force. So we would engage and continue to move where we wanted, but still the pure mass of Somali fighters. There was 500,000 people in that city that day, and they didn't want us there. So it became evident pretty early that this was going to be a fight all day long to try and get to our troops that were at those crash sites and bring them all back. So after that initial move just south of Mike's crash site, we went back to the south, came up from the west to try and get into his objective. We linked up with the other half of the ground reaction force that was led by Bob Gallagher, my platoon sergeant. They were terribly shot up, had a series of casualties in their vehicles. They were pushing one of the Humvees down the road because it wasn't mobile anymore. It was a tough scene at that point. So what we did at that, we were just north of the K4 Circle. When you're looking at a map of the city, K4 Circle was a big intersection, which was just north of our aircraft hangar that we operated out of. So that was one of the hubs that we drove through, and it would spider off to all different parts of the city. We were just north of K4 Circle when we linked up with Bob and the other half of the Humvee force, and we cross-loaded all the casualties. The TOC back at the airfield gave us directions at that point to burn the disabled vehicle and then make our way back to the airfield with the amount of casualties that we had taken, download the casualties, and then get ready for another insertion back into the city. So that's what everything looked like as the sunlight was starting to fade on Sunday, the 3rd of October.
So how many people were still left out there that you knew of when you had to
there
go?
There was 90 people that were north still between crash site 1 and crash site 2.
90 Americans.
Correct.
Wow.
As we exfilled our task force in the ground vehicles back to the airfield at sundown, that was the status. And then we started the new mission of linking up with the coalition forces and the 10th Mountain Division to prepare to go back out that night in armored vehicles to lead the task force back up to the 2 crash sites to recover everybody.
Did you have any advantage at nighttime with the sophisticated equipment, or did that even matter?
Yeah, we did. We had a huge advantage. The tough thing, and I mentioned it earlier, was the guys who fast roped in earlier in the day at 3 o'clock had decided not to bring their night vision devices. And then when they're there at nightfall, they're at a big disadvantage. They were able to recover a few pairs of night vision devices from the aircraft that had went in, and they used those, but not until we linked up with them later in the night. We had our vehicle, so we had a full complement of night vision. We brought extra gear with us, and so we were able to resupply and augment that ability to fight at night and have a control over that situation.
Well, so what went on at nighttime, and were you in the vehicles the whole time, or you split between that and your feet, or what?
Yeah, well, I stayed in the Humvees. The 10th Mountain folks from their QRF, they cross-loaded into the BTRs, the Malaysian vehicles. And the Pakistanis provided us with a few tanks who were using them to block some of the roadblocks and obstacles that could just bust through that. So we had a task force that provided us more capability to bust through obstacles to provide that armor support. But my element, my platoon in the Rangers was still in the Humvee. So we spent the entire night. We left about 11 o'clock. So it was about a 5-hour prep process of linking up with the coalition forces, teaching them about our weapon systems. They had never used night vision goggles before, so we're trying to teach them on the fly how to use some of this new equipment so we can take this entire force back up to the 2 crash sites and exfil our folks that are stuck up there.
Were you taking much enemy fire during the night?
As we were doing we had come back into the UN compound at nightfall, and then when we linked up with the Malaysians and the Pakistanis and the 10th Mountain folks, we were under the protection of the UN compound. So at 11:20 that night, when we pulled back out into the city, we immediately, again, at this point, we had a pretty specific mission. We knew we had to get from point A to point B to secure those 2 crash sites, to recover anybody that was still there, and then come back. The Somalis also knew that. They knew where those 2 helicopters were, and they knew where we were, and they knew that they had to keep us from getting there. So it was a pretty constant and intense firefight from the minute we pulled out of the gates that night. We fought for almost 3 hours to get from the airfield back up to where the 2 crash sites were.
Well, so what happened next, and when did you decide? Okay, now we can go back to the base again.
Well, it was about 02 when we linked up with the 2 crash sites. Our ground reaction force split. We sent a small element down to where, so we were on National Road. National Street was about halfway between the 2 crash sites when we worked our way back through the city. We sent one element to the south to search Durant's aircraft site, and then we sent the half of the BTRs that were going to be used to exfil casualties up to the northern crash site where Cliff Walcott was. Again, the intent from our commander, the Task Force Ranger commander, was that we would recover everybody, get all casualties accounted for, everybody extracted from the aircraft before we would leave that objective site. So that was the delay. Removing the casualties from the aircraft proved much more difficult and took much longer than we thought it would.
So at that point, did you know? Now, my memory is not great here. So was Cliff Walcott killed?
He was, yes.
Okay.
Cliff and his co-pilot were both killed in the aircraft when they went in.
So did you know at that time they were killed?
Yes.
Okay. And what about Mike Durant? Did you know the status of him?
Mike was missing when the elements split and half of our force went to the southern crash site. Mike, there was no personnel at the southern crash site, so there was an accountability issue there. Mike and his co-pilot and the 2 task force operators that fast roped in were unaccounted for at that point. So.
Okay. So what's next then? How do you move from that?
Well, we exfilled the people out of crash site 2, and we continued with the recovering everybody from crash site 1. Again, it took us a while to extract Cliff and his co-pilot from that aircraft. The decision was finally made, hey, let's get everybody out of that aircraft. Once that's complete, we'll have everybody accounted for from crash site 1, all the casualties that had been there overnight in those buildings waiting for exfil. And then starting our element moving back to the east. And then the Pakistani stadium was the exfil point where we were moving everybody to in vehicles. And the Pakistani soccer stadium was a good location to choose. It was within the UN border protection again. it provided a walled facility for the medevac helicopters to come in and exfil the high amount of casualties that had been taken that night. So the aircraft kept coming in. They by the time we got to the Pakistani stadium, fought our way. At this point, it's daylight again. By the time we recovered everybody, we're losing our ability to have control over a nighttime capability with our night vision goggles. Once the sun comes up, we called it the great equalizer. They knew where we were, they knew who we were, and they didn't want us there. So the fight continued that next morning until we were able to work our way back to that stadium and provide some protection for the task force.
So when was your mission over?
Well, it's interesting. When we arrived at the stadium, it was a very difficult situation because we finally realized the true extent of the amount of casualties, the amount of wounded, the amount of people that needed to be evacuated, and it was difficult because we never give names or anything on the radio calls, and our task force had been separated since early the afternoon before. So for 18 hours we had heard of people bleeding out during the night, other casualties being taken, but we never knew who they were. So that next day at the Pakistani stadium was the real realization of what the night had done to the task force. So it was a tough situation to bring the task force back together and see the true extent of the battle. We got everybody exfilled. Everybody was flown back to the airfield, and then the commander told me that our vehicles were really shot up. We had two of them that were hit with RPGs that were still functioning. Most of them were operating on the run flat tires. A lot of the windshields had been shot out. So it was a moving, motor pool nightmare. I'd say, the vehicles did a great job though. They kept us going from point A to point B, and we did what we needed. But my boss said, hey, we need to drive those vehicles back to the airfield so we can use them later and get them fixed up. And at that point, on the 4th of October, the last thing I wanted to do was get back in those vehicles and drive anywhere in the city. So they provided air cover. They had some of the little birds and some cobras that flew air cover, and we were able to skirt around to the north and came in a back way where there wasn't much visibility or urban area. We were able to skirt around most of it and get back. But it was a tough day at that point. But again, our senior bosses gave us a pretty quick turn on. Hey, we know you guys just had your nose bloodied. We got in a good fight, but we have some people that are unaccounted for, and if we can find out where they are, we're going back in after them. So let's not feel sorry for ourselves. Let's remain focused and let's get this task force back up on its feet and get ready for another mission if we can identify where any of these people are being held.
So did you go back out looking, or what happened?
Yeah, we did not. We 2 days later, they started to fly in some reinforcements. So some armored people came from the 24th Division with some Bradleys and M1 tanks, which were a great sight to see. Another Ranger company, another special operations unit came into country, and much needed reinforcements. And we kept training every day for once we realized that Mike Durant was being held, we kept training for a mission to go back into the city to recover Mike and find out where he was and where he was being held. So General Garrison gave us pretty direct instructions that, hey, if we can get a good intel hit on where he's being held, we're going. So again, we trained on a variety of different extraction opportunities, both helo and vehicle bound. But it was 10-11 days later when Mike was finally released back to the UN and brought back to the airfield, and then that ended that opportunity to go back in after him.
Okay. So were you in there at the airfield the whole time?
Yeah, we continued to train. We had a couple different locations that we used for our training and live fire stuff, but we stayed right there in our facility and you're trying to recover the bodies that were missing and then find out where Mike Durant's location was.
So what were some of the lessons learned, from this whole battle over those few days?
Well, it's interesting. The big things that I like to talk about is the small unit leadership. When people have a good intent and understand the mission that they're going after, it's amazing what young soldiers will do, and step into spaces that are created by guys getting wounded. So it really was a great lesson in leaders stepping in when other leaders were wounded or taken off the mission. So from that perspective, understanding the leader's intent and knowing what the mission is. So when squad leader Jones gets wounded, his team leader moves right in and continues the mission, and there's never a loss in any unit capability. So it was amazing to watch with the amount of people that we had injured and killed, and everybody just stepped up and took the next role. So it really was a lot of hard training and people understanding the mission and being able to continue to execute. One of the other lessons learned we talked about is physical fitness and your ability to fight through difficult missions like this. When adrenaline kicks in and your body's running 120% and you're not eating and you're not sleeping, and it's a survival thing versus worrying about the simple little things. So when your life is on the line and you're trying to recover teammates and fellow Rangers, it's amazing what your system will do. And then a day later, there was that big crash afterwards when your system was finally able to let down and get some rest. The fitness piece is twofold too. We talked about recovery from wounds and the guys that were wounded pretty bad. Their ability to recover from wounds a lot of times was a direct reflection to their physical fitness level before they were wounded. So these guys were physical specimens. They were wounded, they recovered, they had that will to get back and be a part of the team, and they went through their recovery process and they came right back and were ready to get in it. So a couple angles there on fitness, but these type of fights really take a toll on a system and a unit, and the better prepared you are for that from a fitness level, it really pays dividends later.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah, and then the last one that I talk about is the medical training. When you look at the numbers of people that we had wounded and killed that day, your basic allotment of medical folks doesn't cover all the angles, and the medics, the docs were amazing. They were out there in the fight. They're trying to pull casualties back under cover, and they're getting wounded themselves. So once you get a medic wounded, that really messes up the numbers on that ratio of how many guys you got for a medic to take care of. We had 18 killed and 80 more wounded out of a 140 man task force. So
wow.
There was a lot of people who understood the basics of casualty treatment and stop the bleeding, treat for shock, do all the basic stuff, and keep guys in the fight versus not being able to do that and losing a guy because we weren't taking the right initial steps. So, and I think the special ops units do that as well as anybody. They send additional people to EMT, to combat lifesaver, to the special ops medics go to the 18 Delta course. So they are very well prepared for the scenarios, and they train other people on how to be effective when things are going bad around you. We always, when we were out training, we'd always have the young guy give an IV in the middle of the night just to test his capabilities, and that stuff pays off when you're in a bad situation, and he's got to give an IV for real. He's not doing it for the first time.
Oh yeah. Well, this may be an obvious question, but just I'm going to ask it anyway because you may have some different insight. How did this mission, or this battle in Mogadishu, how was it different than some of your other missions like to Grenada or Panama or anywhere else?
Well, it's interesting. I think more than anything was the intensity and the size of the fight. They talk about how that battle on the 3rd and 4th of October was as big a ground combat battle as the U.S. had been in since Vietnam. So from the size and scope of what we were able to accomplish under tough odds, it really was an amazing fight. A lot of guys learned a lot about themselves. a lot about their subordinates, about how people reacted under difficult situations, and I think a lot of them carried that forward into their lives now. They respect the guys that they lost. They came to closure with that, but they also realize that, hey, there's a lot of positives that you can learn from these bad situations, and put things into perspective. Hey, when some people think things are bad around them, they're not that bad. I've been through worse, and I can relate to it, but I also can work around it and get back to what's important. So I think from that perspective, it's great to see our task force, who got put in a tough situation, grew because of it. We had a lot of great lessons learned. We changed a lot of what happened with the special ops community. This is 1993, and 8 years later, in 2001, they're getting ready to redeploy to Afghanistan, and a lot of the lessons learned from Somalia were worked into the community and changed for the positive, and had a great impact when they went into the next series of conflicts, less than 10 years later.
Yeah. That's a good point. Is there anything that you can share specifically that was learned from Somalia that was implemented and used later on in the War on Terror?
Well, yeah, a couple things specifically. Like the Humvees that we used were just basic Humvees that we tinkered with. We added some Kevlar plating from some of the Blackhawks, that they had extra Kevlar blankets, so we didn't want to go into a mined area. So we enhanced our Humvees. The up armored Humvees that they use now in Iraq and Afghanistan are armored. They have turrets on top. They protect the gunners up on top of those vehicles. Our guys, I had 8 Humvees out there that night, four marked 19 and 450 cow gunners, and they had zero protection in that turret other than that weapon that they were firing. So those guys had more courage than anybody else out there, and they understood the importance of that weapon system, and they kept it in the fight. So my hat's off to that team and what they were able to do, again, under tough circumstances. The other one that was a switch. Again, we were right in the city, in the airfield in Mogadishu, and we left a big signature when our task force took off with 12, 13 helicopters and 10 Humvees, and it was a pretty big group of folks that were going in the city. Not a year later in Haiti, for the mission in the Ranger jump down there. They had one of the Ranger battalions on the USS America, so they totally changed the ability to move that signature, launch off an aircraft carrier from the ocean, and not give them a lot of lead time on where that strike force was coming from. Again, and then they used that again when the war started in Afghanistan. I was on the Kitty Hawk off the coast of southern Afghanistan when they were doing helicopter operations into Afghanistan when the war first started. So again, they used those lessons learned and the ability to use a new launch platform with less signature to still conduct the same type of operations.
Okay. Were you injured during Mogadishu?
I was not.
Okay.
So I'm not a very big guy, so I was never a very big target. Everybody had a little something. A lot of the windows were shot out. People were cut. People had a lot going on. But there was a lot of people that were wounded and shot out pretty bad that day. So it was an ability to keep the task force and everything moving from point A to point B. They a couple of days after the big fight, they asked anybody that had shrapnel or glass wounds, no matter what it was, to go up to one of the aid stations just to get some x-rays to see, hey, you might have a cut in your chin or in your shoulder, but there could be a lump of metal in there also. So they just wanted to identify that kind of internal injuries that you couldn't tell right away. So it was interesting to see, some of the shrapnel wounds, some of the guys who, hey, this is something that's not really bothering me. But it could have turned into something a lot worse once we identified what those were.
Okay. Well, what about now? What are some of the things that you talk to? Because I know you meet new people all the time and you speak to groups. So What are some of the things that you speak to groups now about?
Well, I think some of the lessons learned from what we did in Somalia, the difficult situation that our folks got put in, and were able to come through it. I hit on those similar topics about leadership, about mentorship, about taking care of your subordinates, because that always comes back around in the next capacity, whether you're still in uniform and get promoted and they come work for you again, or if you're a civilian and someone needs to call you and ask for assistance. That mentorship piece is huge. And so you never know when you're going to run into somebody who did you a good deed before, but keeping those bonds and keeping those connections are huge, especially with the mentor type of platform that we're working with the Three Rangers Foundation. We look to get guys who have been through similar situations, who want to help, who want to stay connected in the veteran space and want to be a part of our team in helping vets and showing their commitment to this fight that's been going on for 15 years now. One of the other things we talk about is responsibility and accountability. I think that's one of the things we're missing right now, and trying to get that instilled in a younger generation, showing that, hey, when you accept that, hey, I made a mistake or I did something wrong, it doesn't matter if you're a leader or if you're a subordinate. If you take that step and people understand that, hey, this guy's being accountable for what he did, and they'll respect you even much more afterwards. So some people want to try and deflect that, and I think in our society and our government today, if we had a little more accountability and responsibility for actions, it would really help out. We also talk a little bit with our foundation about the situation we're in with a lot of wounded veterans and PTSD issues with this 15th year of the war now. I love that there are foundations like ours who are willing to help, and that there are a lot of patriotic Americans who want to support us and donate money and be a part of our programs. But I also believe that we need to carry a message to Washington, D.C. and to our leadership that when I take young soldiers into battle, whether it's Somalia or Afghanistan or wherever it might be, our government has a responsibility to treat them for the rest of their lives. We took them into battle. They got wounded. There shouldn't be a cap on care for a soldier based on his injuries that have to be filled by a Wounded Warrior Project or a Three Rangers Foundation or the Lead the Way Fund. It should be covered. There shouldn't be any gaps, and that's a void that we're trying to fill by speaking to people. Hey, again, I love what I do, and I love the foundation work. But I wish that there wasn't a need for 40,000 nonprofits to try and fill these voids that are created by someone else not doing their job.
Oh yeah, good point. Well, how are things going with Three Rangers Foundation? It's
good. This is our second year now. We're getting a lot of positive feedback. We're helping a big group of vets. Again, it's very rewarding to be able to reach back to a community that you grew up in. I left home on my 18th birthday, and most of my adult life was spent in uniform. And being able to reach back into that community and help a soldier in need is really a great feeling. So I love the work. We're connected to the Three Rangers Project. We have a whiskey label that's very successful. It's a premium rye whiskey. It's being sold across the United States now. It's picking up a lot of visibility and momentum. And the Three Rangers whiskey sales help provide the proceeds from the sales help out our foundation with our administrative costs. So all of our donations from patriotic folks out there go to help vets instead of paying our overhead fees and salaries or costs associated with doing our business. So we love that model. We hope the whiskey really gets a lot of visibility this second year after January and gets going in more places. We're selling it now in AFES through the military exchange PX system. The Navy exchange has picked up a contract. So it's getting a lot of visibility. We're getting some great feedback, and the foundation grows because of this also. So we're excited about our twofold process that we're working.
Good. Well, I'll have a link to the Three Rangers Foundation in the show notes also. Your foundation helps people who are injured, but is it for anyone? Maybe people needing financial assistance, or is it just for those suffering from injuries, whether they're PTSD or physically related?
No, it is not just injury. So again, we have a pretty broad scope. We help veterans of all eras with different types of needs. So we have a fitness and wellness director that's based up near Chicago. He has an amazing program. It's called the 1 Million Fit. He's got an online fitness program that vets can sign up for. He actually runs a gym up in the Chicago area. But fitness and wellness play a big part in this veteran rehabilitation. We have a financial director that helps us out with veterans in need for financial assistance. And then we have a series of other directors who do special projects but help out with mentorship, getting additional folks into our system. So again, we don't have a specific calling that, hey, you have to be of post 9/11 or a certain type of injury. If you have a need and we do our screen and you fit into our system, then we'll help you out. And one of the things we want to do with the Three Rangers team is we want to build our mentorship umbrella with additional folks that we've helped through the system. If we have a soldier that's in need of financial assistance, he likes the capability that we provide, we'd like to get him back up on his feet. And then a year from now, we'd love for him to be one of our mentors to talk about our programs and how he can fill that same process that we helped him with a year or 2 years ago.
Yeah, I think that's a great plan right there to use the ones you've got. And is it threerangersfoundation.org? That's
correct. Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, threerangers.com is the for-profit side, the whiskey, and they have some other products they sell. The whiskey map shows all the different locations where the whiskey's being sold across the U.S.
Okay.
And then threerangersfoundation.org is our foundation website. We're actually right in the process right now, probably within the next 2 weeks. We have a company here in the Virginia Beach area that has done a complete website rebuild. So we're getting ready to launch a new site with some additional capabilities. They did some great work for us, pro bono to help out the foundation. So we're excited about the partnerships and some of the connectivity we're getting based on our good work with veterans.
Great. There's a lot of good people out there that want to help out in some way and serve and donate. And that's good to hear that company did the website, pro bono like that.
Yeah, like I said earlier, there's a lot of great patriotic folks out there, and our veteran population is small, but there's a lot of folks out there who understand the amount of weight they carry, not only through this conflict, but a lot of prior conflicts. And we've got a lot of Vietnam veterans right now that are getting a lot of the care that they didn't get. My oldest daughter is in an orthotics and prosthetics master's program at the University of Hartford right now, and one of the things that they're seeing with all these advanced prosthetics with the current global war on terror injuries is that there's a population of Vietnam veterans who have been walking around on 40-year-old out-of-date prosthetics, and they also want to get this new advanced technology. So it's adding an additional burden to the VA system, but these guys are just as well deserved of this new technology as anybody else. So it's great to see that they have these college programs, these new prosthetic companies that are really doing yeoman's work in building this technology and making these guys more whole.
Oh yeah, I agree. Well, anything else, Larry, that you want to talk about, or anything we've missed that you feel is important to share?
No, Thad, this is amazing. I appreciate the opportunity. Again, anytime we get to talk about these great heroes and giants that we walked amongst, I feel blessed to have been a part of this mission. I love talking about these young kids that I served with. They're 23 years ago, so they're not young kids anymore. But we have a great group of folks who accomplished a big task under tough circumstances, and again, it's great to be a part of it and stay connected with them. And the Three Rangers Foundation was built by some guys who were a part of that mission also. So it's a great connection with some great folks behind it who understand veteran needs. So again, I appreciate the opportunity to talk today. We'll definitely stay in touch, and we'll get you some more Task Force Ranger folks on your podcasts. So.
That'd be great. I really appreciate you, sir. You are an American hero, and it's my honor to speak with you today.
Awesome. Thanks again, Thad. Appreciate it.